Let's rewind maybe and just talk about who we are, because we're just two handsome sounding voices at this stage, Stan.
Face made for radio. Both of us.
Speak for yourself. All right, I'll start by asking you, can you just tell us who you are, how you came to the subject of storytelling, where your passion for it came from, and maybe just tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your background.
I am reluctant to make this podcast all about our stories, because I believe it's about our listeners' stories. But in the podcast medium, that's actually acceptable and actually probably okay, because if people are listening to you for an hour to an hour and a half per episode on a podcast, they really want to get to know you. And this is Chats Over Beer. So pretending we're at a nice pub or bar with our listeners, depending on where you're from, how did I get into storytelling? Well, it all goes back to when I was 4 years old, really. One of 5 children, growing up in Belfast, Northern Ireland. My dad was teaching theology, was actually getting his PhD in theology, and then he became a pastor later in life, Church of England minister. And my mother was, at that time, a French and Spanish teacher who was raising her children. And I found that being one of 5 children, there wasn't a lot of attention. Everything was great till my little brother was born, and then all of a sudden the attention went to him and then my little sister. And I found that as a small child, my father was particularly proudly British, where he said, well, I'm going to let my wife deal with the children until they have something intelligent to say. And he'd sit and read books, and we'd run around and fight in the house, and he'd barely look up unless something was really amiss. And my grandfather, Alan Cook, Pop Cook, they called him, he was over visiting us, and it was 1982 during the Falklands War. And I remember he used to switch off his hearing aid because he didn't want to hear all the noise. Four young boys running around at the time. And apparently I got him to switch on his hearing aid and was giving him running commentary on the Falklands War. And it was actually intelligible, or let's say even somewhat intelligent. And he was quite surprised, and he called my father over, who had studied history, and said, Peter, you need to watch this one. He's pretty smart. And as a 4-year-old, positive reinforcement, attention in a family where I don't think any family has perfect situation, but we had busy parents and finite amounts of attention. They were doing their best. But I found that I really connected with my father over history. My father at that point took an interest to my interest in history, and that just became a positive, very positive feedback loop. And 9 years old, my mother, who's American, and my father, who's English, growing up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in the Troubles, they realized that perhaps there's a better future for us somewhere else. Moved to the United States. And well, before I talk about the United States, Belfast, I thought was a wonderful place to grow up, because we saw soldiers in the street all the time, and it was kind of exciting, and bombs were going off here and there. And not that that's a great thing. Obviously, as a child, you don't understand the consequences of war, potentially, unless it personally affects you and your family. But I thought it was normal. And when I moved to the States, one of the earliest inklings was, where are all the soldiers who were stationed on the streets? The British soldiers that were at checkpoints all over the place. So moved to the United States and Lake Charles, Louisiana. Quite a culture shock. And one of the first things I did was I did a presentation in my class about Great Britain and British history, specifically World War II and Winston Churchill and the Battle of Britain. It was quite impressive. So I realized, as a shy Irish kid, that I impressed quite a bit my American classmates, of whom I was a bit afraid or a little bit shy around. And again, positive reinforcement loop. I'm a historian, and that's the way people know and respect me. And it's just let's say a story I kind of told myself from early age, which was I liked history and I became good at it. And when you believe something about yourself, you tend to reinforce that and develop that skill and manifest it. So fast forward to 18, I'm a trumpet player growing up, love of music, love movie soundtracks, love watching movies and listening to the music. But I lost the Louisiana trumpet competition to my best friend, which was an intolerable slight. And I decided that, okay, I'm not going to be a professional trumpet player if I can't even win the Louisiana trumpet competition against my friend, who was obviously not as good as me. And he went on actually to become a fantastic trumpet player. And I decided, my brother said to me, after I'd read all this history, used to go to American Civil War battlefields with my parents, go to all these places and drag them around, literally family vacations, dragging them around Civil War battlefields and learning history. I heard from my brother, who said to me, Sam, have you ever heard of West Point? And West Point's a United States military academy. And I said, yeah, of course I've read about it. I knew that George Patton, who I remember watching the movie Patton with my father and reading the books about Patton. And he was kind of my idol growing up, probably because I like to behave a lot like him in some ways. And I said, yes, of course I knew, but I didn't know it existed still. And he said, yes, that's where you can actually go there. It's a university. It's where the best young men in the country, actually women too, leaders go to challenge themselves. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a grand adventure. It's even free. The government pays you to go there if you get in. So it's highly competitive, comparable to a Harvard or, let's say, Oxford education in terms of its quality and its rigor. Then you get the physical component, the military component. And I thought, wow, this sounds great.